everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're gonna play with yellow dye and create some fun yellow yarn. Specifically, we're gonna play around with combining a fluorescent yellow acid dye with a non-fluorescent acid dye. Now, sometimes when you combine colors that are fluorescent with others that aren't, you can see fluorescence in the non-fluorescent color, like you can see in this gray right here. But I have observed that when you combine a fluorescent yellow with a non-fluorescent yellow, the fluorescence seems to disappear or be quenched, which I'll talk about more as we go on, but this is exactly what I want to explore today. And so we're going to play around with our fluorescent yellow by itself, our non-fluorescent yellow by itself, and combine the two in a way to see what we observe. But before we go and measure out our acid dyes for today, I have a message from our sponsor. This portion of today's episode of Dyepot Weekly is sponsored by the Color Alchemy Masterclass, an in-depth online dyeing course taught by educator and fiber artist Alana Wilcox. Color Alchemy goes beyond just dyeing yarn. The course focuses on truly understanding color, how digital color inspiration photos translates to a color palette and dyed fiber, and then how to create reproducible color results across different types of fibers, adjusting your recipes and techniques to achieve those results. Registration is now open for the spring session, which will run from March through May 2026, and registration will remain open through February 27th. The Color Alchemy Masterclass combines on-demand lessons with 4 live Zoom sessions, where students will work on things like pulling color palettes from photos, translating those colors into dye formulas, understanding why digital colors and dyed fiber may behave a little bit differently, and organizing their dye notes so that way they can reproduce their results later on. There's also ongoing support through private Discord spaces for both current students and alumni, where participants can ask questions, share results, and get direct feedback from Alana and the community. I haven't taken the full Color Alchemy Masterclass myself, but I have used Alana's color tools and reviewed her Creating a Digital Dye Notebook on-demand course. Alana's teaching style is clear, practical, and very approachable. You can learn more and register at alanawilcox.com. Spots are limited and registration for the spring course is open through February 27th, 2026. And of course, feel free to reach out to Alana if you have questions about upcoming sessions, because she does offer the Color Alchemy Masterclass 3 times a year. Thank you so much, Color Alchemy Masterclass, for sponsoring this portion of today's video. And now, let's go play with some yellow dye. Our 2 yellows, Fluorescent Lemon and Brilliant Yellow, are both primary colors. They're just different pigments. One is fluorescent, one is not. One takes a little bit more time to strike, which I think is you. One can strike a little bit faster. Now, the poster swatches on here right now look very similar, but they do swatch differently. And at times when I've used both of them together on one yarn, you can see the differences, even though it is very, very subtle. So our yarn that goes into both colors may feel very, very similar all throughout. But I'm hoping we may or may not see a difference with the way the fluorescence goes into that yarn. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to measure out and dissolve some of our yellow dyes. I weighed out 0.5 grams of each of our yellows twice. This will be half of a gram. This will give us half of a gram of each color for when I'm dip dyeing into the color separately, and then half of a gram of each color for when I dip dye our yarn into both colors. I dissolved the dyes in some hot tap water, not worrying about the total volume because I plan to add all of the dye from one of the cups into the relevant dye bath. Things look so similar at this point. Turn off the red light, bring over the black light. You could see we do have fluorescence over here, not over here. And there's some optical brightener in the posters there. The yarn we're going to be dyeing today is Knit Pick's Stroll Fingering Weight yarn. This yarn is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. And I'm gonna go ahead and pre-soak all of it in just some plain tap water with no additional acid for at least 30 minutes, but more likely overnight, depending on where the day takes us. I have 2 dye pots set up on my stove, each with 24 cups of water. This one is my 8-quart pot, the other is the 12-quart pot, and I'm gonna add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tablespoons of white vinegar to each pot. This gives us a ratio of 3 tablespoons of white vinegar per 8 cups of water. A bit higher than what I normally use, but I'm aiming to get different saturation levels when I dip dye our yarns. Now in this pot, I'm gonna add our 1/2 gram of dissolved brilliant yellow dye. This is the non-fluorescent pigment. And since the water is hot, I'm going to rinse out the cup at the sink, because if I added the plastic cup to this hot water, it would melt. And I'm gonna give this a good stir. And now I'm bringing over 200 grams of our pre-soaked yarn. I feel like I may have dip dyed yarn into these 2 colors before, but I don't remember. It is okay if we end up with some white left over because all of the color absorbs onto the yarn, but the goal is to have more saturated yarn at one end and a less saturated version of the color at the other end. It is just that with yellow, that can be really hard to see sometimes. Because it is a color that a lot of times if I added 1/2 gram of dye of a lot of different colors, if I added it into a dye bath, the liquid would look really opaque. That wasn't the case with our yellow here. Now, when I dip dye our yarn into both colors, I may not end up adding the entire yarn into the dye bath. I may like leave a portion out, but we will see, because I'm hoping to keep, you know, some fluorescence there. But what you can see is right here, we've got that dark yellow, we've got this lighter yellow, and this whole process right here took, well, this clip is currently 2.5 minutes long, but I added the dye and did other things before we started dip dyeing. It did not take very long here. I'm gonna go ahead and set a timer for 30 minutes to finish heat setting this. Here we are at our second dye bath. This is my 12-quart pot. It also has 24 cups of water with 9 tablespoons of white vinegar. I'm gonna add our 1/2 gram of the Fluorescent Lemon dye this time. Rinsing out the cup. And because of course I didn't label any of the yarns, you can see here that we are definitely fluorescent. I mean, we'll see the fluorescence in the finished yarn later on. But, you know, it's fun to see. Okay, I am bringing over our yarn. I am standing on a step stool just to make it a little bit easier. Now, one of the joys of neon yarn is not the fact that you have a black light, and you can see how bright that color is. The joy of these fluorescent colors is that they give a very beautiful neon color. It's sort of just like a fun perk that these colors happen to be fluorescent and glow under a black light. Now, how often does wanting to play with black lights come up? Not that often. Ooh, this is absorbing faster than I expected. I'm not sure how much of a gradient we're getting so far, but we're certainly getting lighter. What I'm hoping is that we will be able to see on the lightest end even a little bit of fluorescence. But it is boding really, really well for me that this is happening this quickly. Just because, gosh, I mean, I knew that fluorescent yellow absorbs at a different rate from like fluorescent pink because safety orange breaks, but it's nice that this is not taking like 5 minutes or something to dip dye. There's still like a hint of pigment in there, but this is going super fast, which is good. yeah, it's okay if we don't end up adding all of the other yarn into the dye bath in the end. I don't know if there's going to be back staining or anything. I think that I'm going to try, because we'll do the brilliant yellow first. Okay, this one is very subtle. You can see right now we do have a lighter end and a darker end. Hopefully that'll remain and we won't have a ton of back staining. We will see. I'm also going to set a timer here for 30 minutes. But I want there to be at least some fluorescence on the yarn when we dip dye into both. And we'll see if we end up with sort of like overall fluorescence like we see here, that's very bright, versus not seeing any like on our other pot. But anyway, at this point, we're gonna wait for 30 minutes and then we'll be back to remove our yarns. And I'm probably gonna reuse these exact same dye baths for our next round of dip dyeing. You know, there are a lot of different ways that we could have played around with this experiment. With dip dyeing, we know we're gonna have different proportions of the two colors mixed together, but I could have done this on mini skeins and had the colors mixed at different proportions. Say, you know, 100% of each yellow, a 50-50 mix, and then maybe a 75-25 or something, just to see what we saw. However, the measurement of is this yarn fluorescence in my home is very qualitative. I am not measuring in any way the amount of light that is emitted here to indicate that there is fluorescence. There are things that if this was an actual experiment I wanted to do in a lab, there's other tools I could use. But this is more about the fun and the potential here. I like talking about using fluorescence to create secret messages on things, like say on a sock blank, and there's the potential with the colorless fluorescent acid dye. But if the brilliant yellow quenches the fluorescent lemon, you could do a yellow on yellow with a secret message. That might be a little bit easier for you to see while you work on it and still be extraordinarily subtle. So there's potential to have fun, especially if you have a friend or loved one who enjoys using a black light. But anyway, let's go remove our yarn from the dye bath. It has been 30 minutes, so let's remove our yarn. Ooh, goody, we got like a little bit of pastel yellow up on one edge, like the tiniest amount up here. I may try to leave some of the yarn out when I do the next dip dye, so we have some yarn that does not have any of the brilliant yellow on it, but we will sort of see as we do that dip dye momentarily. But first I want to remove our other yarn from the dye bath, and even though this one edge was way more pastel when we started, I think we do have some evidence of some back staining. No, there's some white there. There's a hint of some color left in there. The colors do go from more saturated to less saturated. This is just way more subtle. I am curious. Okay, even right here we do see a little bit of a difference. It's extraordinarily subtle, and okay, with the black light I do see a difference. It'll be easier, I think, when we have actually, it's easier now here that the lighter side is closest to the black light. You can see we have more fluorescence and less fluorescence here. So this will still be good for a comparison, even though all over the color, there's a lot of color all over and it's very subtle. The goal is not to have, like, the colors could be more concentrated down here than up here on our next skein. It's more of that we do see like a change, deeper fluorescence and lighter fluorescence as we go through. And so that is more of what I wanted to see versus if we see all of a sudden, even though we know that there's a little bit sort of further down, if we see no fluorescence over the other yellow. Okay, and now we're gonna do this again with our brilliant yellow. And it's helpful that we saw less back staining with this color. And truly, what we saw with the other yellow may not have been back staining or some of the color coming out of one area and then binding into another. It could just be, since we do have residual color in that other pan, it could just be as simple as that. Some residual color in the pan. All right, and this time, as I dip dye into the brilliant yellow, I'm gonna go a little bit slower, and I do think I'm gonna leave part of the yarn out of the pot. But again, the comparison, really, the other one is just a control to show what no fluorescence looks like. To see, okay, do we see a little bit of fluorescence on that deeper yellow or on some of the lighter yellow that we have? And so the reason for bobbing the yarn as I dip dye in the pan is to get, well, both a smoother transition. If I were to place and hold it, you would get more of a line and less of a gradient. But also, if I were to not move it, there's yarn sort of in the center of these skeins, and that yarn may not absorb as much color. And so by bobbing it, it's giving, I guess, all of the yarn, it's sort of like stirring all of the yarn a little bit of access. And after, you know, a minute, it has mostly absorbed. I am going to leave that little bit of yarn out of the container. We have pastel and deeper color. Hopefully I have enough of the pastel section. I will be covering more of this yarn with the fluorescent color and potentially putting it all in the pot at that point, just to attempt to get fluorescence on the deepest areas so we can compare this to the yarn that has no fluorescent pigment. So I guess I'm gonna go ahead and let this sit for, gosh, I guess 15 minutes. Just to manage expectations, when you mix a fluorescent pigment with another pigment, say to get radioactive, which is a fluorescent green, it is not as bright as the yellow because there's another pigment in there that absorbs some of the light, and it's just not quite as fluorescent, even though it is still fluorescent. And so the reduced fluorescence isn't necessarily quenching or anything. It was just, if I think I dipped this Fluorescent Lemon yarn into silver gray, I think we would still see fluorescence coming through that gray, because that's what we saw when I had silver gray over a little bit of a optical brightener, a colorless fluorescent acid dye. And so that is sort of what I'm anticipating. Potentially some, if it wasn't quenching, some reduced fluorescence. But the reason why quenching is even on my radar is that when it comes to Jacquard's Blacklight Blue or the optical brightener that I mentioned, they told me that when you mix that pigment with pinks, unfortunately, it quenches the fluorescence, it kills the fluorescence. So something about pink molecules and that bluer optical brightener pigment, you can't sort of combine them and combine that colorless fluorescent acid dye with fluorescent fuchsia to get a beautiful fluorescent purple, like you can by combining fluorescent lemon with fluorescent fuchsia to get a beautiful fluorescent orange. And so therefore this has just been on my radar a little bit, and what I observed on the roving made me very curious, because I expected to see the fluorescence extend further than it did, but maybe it was the technique. So we'll see. And again, I know all the results we're going to have today are going to be very qualitative, but sometimes when you observe something and then you try to do it again and you observe a very similar result, then you can start to make conclusions, which shouldn't be the end all be all, but I don't know, it's fun. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn off the heat here, and we do have some water that wicked down, but not dye. Okay, I'm gonna set the yarn aside to cool just a little bit because I'm gonna need to rotate those zip ties. Our yarn is still quite warm, but I'm gonna wanna take the zip tie and move it down to the darkest of our brilliant yellow sections, attempting to have everything be even. So we're rotating it about 180 degrees. So I'm gonna just pick up the zip tie where it was and move it to the other end. This way our white yarn that should have no brilliant yellow dye on it will go into our dye bath first for our fluorescent lemon. And so now we can go set up that dye bath. I'm gonna add our 1/2 gram of fluorescent lemon in. You saw me rinse out the cup. And now I'm just gonna stir things up. And we'll come back with the yarn to dip dye. As I bring over the yarn, there are a few different things that I would like to remember. And I guess one of them is that this yarn is warm, so some of the pigments may absorb a little bit faster. That is one thing. I guess the other is that, yes, this yarn is gonna have more pigment on it overall. Look at how yellow or like orange this darker area looks right now. And I'm going very far, but you know what? I am gonna leave, I think, a little bit of this yarn out of the dye bath in the end. So that way we have an area that should have 0 of the fluorescent color on it. Ultimately, you know another way I could have done this? I know I mentioned just like zip ties, but what I probably should have done is just done a solid fluorescent lemon all over the yarn and then dip dyed that into the brilliant yellow, because then we would see if we see a gradient of the fluorescence decreasing or not. But alas, is what it is. I decided to do it this way. Sometimes you end up with ideas that you're like, oh, that might have been a better idea. It's all good. All right. What we're gonna do here, since this dye bath is not as deep as the other one, I am going to carefully balance the yarn with the zip ties onto my tongs to keep that portion out of the yarn. And now I'm going to heat things for 30 minutes. I'm realizing I may regret my tongs being out of commission for 30 minutes as I go and work on other projects, but there was no way for me to leave this hanging out, leaving only those couple of inches outside of the pot, just because the water level is lower, since this is a pot that holds a bigger volume. But anyway, I will see you in 30 minutes. And I'm not bringing over the black light now because I want to see after we've removed the yarn. And maybe we'll wait for things to not be steamy. I'm gonna try to be patient. All right. It has been 30 minutes. I'm gonna turn off the heat. Okay. And now I'm gonna remove our yarn from the dye bath. There's a little bit of lemon there. You can very clearly see the different colors though. But now I'm gonna go ahead and set the yarn aside so that way it could be less steamy before we try to see the fluorescence for the first time. We're gonna wash things in a little bit, but I have to do it. I have to do it. Okay. So I do see some fluorescence in some of the areas where there's overlap. So that fluorescent goes on, but I do think that the yellow is quenching it just because, like, we know that the fluorescence moved all the way up. There's some lighter patches where we can see it. It does seem to just kind of abruptly stop. Like, this isn't like the gray where we're like, ooh, there's some fluorescence coming through. Like, it does feel like it blocks it because I'm not seeing any on that side beyond where there's some white coming through. Now there is a hair in this middle section, which I don't know if that's because there's some areas in here that have, you know, clearly, well, maybe it's got some of both. So it's not like super harsh, but we know that the fluorescent dye came up to about here, and we're seeing what's closest to me, none. Like 0 fluorescence. And I say this compared to our only fluorescent lemon, where we have fluorescence over the whole thing, there are a few areas over here where there is a lot less, or maybe it almost feels like none. But yeah, so who knows? It could be a lightness of it, but even the pretty light amount does glow here. So quenched or not, hard to say. Oh no, I'm thinking of more experiments. I'm gonna let everything cool so we can finish cooling so we can wash it, and I'm hopping back in front of the camera. What experiments do I have in my brain? Well, fluorescent lemon on top of the optical brightener, on top of a fluorescent pink. Do we also see quenching in those situations as well? Or better yet, a side-by-side comparison of the brilliant yellow with the gray. But, you know, it wasn't quite like as harsh of a line because there was a decrease, but, you know, there is a point where you're not seeing any coming through, where I feel like with a similar intensity of a gray, we did. So does this mean if I dye a neon yellow sock blank and I write on it with brilliant yellow that we're gonna see all that fluorescence quenched? Hard to say, but yeah, I may not have something super conclusive here, but it's still fun to see what happens and to think about what we're observing. So we'll bring out the black light again once everything is dry, but for now, let's go wash the yarn. And I know I'm doing a lot of thinking and processing here, but I guess this all comes down to, at some point, if you mix certain colors together, you might lose fluorescence where you might not in other circumstances. Let's wash the combined colorway on camera, because if this one doesn't bleed, since the other yarns have half the total amount of dye as this one, those should not bleed either. Not that that's always the way things work. Sometimes things definitely do not work that way. You could have something bleed with less color than you do when you have more, but for today, I think that should be good. And anyway, we're not seeing any color bleeding, but you know what we do have? Very nice example of the difference between the two colors. Not at, say, like a consistent depth of shade, but you know, it's funny how orange this feels, whereas if I didn't have the other yellow at all, I would feel like, oh, it's just a very saturated yellow. But because the fluorescent lemon is so cool toned, this is feeling almost mustardy to me. But anyway, we're not having any color bleeding here, which is fantastic. So I'm gonna go ahead and wash the rest of the yarn off camera, and I'm gonna hang up everything to dry. Here's the yarn that we dip dyed into a single color. And you can really, really tell the difference between our fluorescent lemon and our brilliant yellow. Not only did the brilliant yellow strike to the yarn faster, but it is a different yellow. It is more of a Crayola yellow versus a highlighter yellow. And then when I turn off our overhead lights, only one of the yarns is fluorescent. There is no fluorescence on the brilliant yellow. The only light we see there is what is reflecting off of our fluorescent lemon, which are overexposed. I'm moving the black light further and further away, and you're seeing the shadow from the camera. Maybe I just need to reduce the exposure. Okay, because now you can see a little bit better with the exposure reduced. So we have more fluorescence down at the darker end, less fluorescence over here. There are a couple of patches that look more white that have a little bit less. Oh my gosh, you can see a little bit if I have the light over here. You can tell that there's more down there, even with the light down here. Oh my gosh. But the point is that we do have fluorescence all over here. Now, I'm going to remove our two middle skeins to bring over our two yarns that were dip dyed into both of the yellows. And in fact, I'm going to flip this one over. Now, I use the exact same amount of dye of fluorescent yellow or non-fluorescent yellow on these two. The two in the middle have I guess, combined. They have the same amount as these two skeins combined. Let's bring out our black light. I guess we may as well first do this with the natural light on. Ho-ho! Okay, with the natural light on, you can see a difference. Now, there is a portion of the yarn here that I intentionally left out. And so, you know, the fluorescence here ended maybe here. It wouldn't have gone all the way to the end. Even though maybe we need to do a project where we have the fluorescent lemon all over and then dip into the other yellow. Okay, but now I have everything off and looking at this. Now, I maybe see a little bit of the fluorescence come through in this area right here. Okay, so in this area, sort of in this middle, you can see it almost feels glazed because you can see a little bit of it popping through. This feels very different. Do I have any of it down here? No. This does feel different to me from how I had a gray that was fluorescent from the Hanukkah sampler. I really do think that this other yellow pigment is absorbing that color, so we're not seeing the light come out. Fluorescence is when you shine a wavelength of light, in this case our black light, onto a colorful molecule. It'll absorb that color and emit a different wavelength of light. And so that's what we're seeing here. Now, if the wavelength of light that it emits is one that gets absorbed by a different color, then you're not going to see that fluorescence anymore because that light's getting absorbed. And I think that that is what is happening over with our brilliant yellow. Because even though they were dyed in different batches and we have some light amount of color that probably was up here, the areas where you can see that brilliant yellow under white light are the areas where we see zero fluorescence. And the little bit that we see coming through could be because there's some areas here, just like we see some whites over here where it didn't bind. There's some areas in here where that brilliant yellow didn't really bind. And so I think that that's what we're seeing versus the fluorescence coming through. Why do we care about the fluorescence being quenched? Well, it's just interesting to me because I was really excited when we got that fluorescent gray over Hanukkah. It made me wonder, could we have a fluorescent, non-fluorescent yellow? And I'm sure that there's a proportion at which it might glow a little bit and we could have a color that is less neon. But if you want a fluorescent yellow, use Fluorescent Lemon. It is the brightest of all of the fluorescent pigments that I use. Potentially even brighter than that optical brightener. But again, I want to see if I can make a better fluorescent green and play around with green. Fluorescent greens are as bright as they are because they have a little amount of blue pigment in there that does not absorb this yellow light that's coming out, and so therefore it'll still fluoresce and you can still see it. And so it's possible that this yellow is too close. It's making me wonder if I have fluorescent fuchsia. I imagine that I might see something similar. If I add too much other pink to it, we might not see that because that deeper pink may absorb those pink wavelengths that are coming out. So anyway, this isn't an entirely scientific explanation, but is more of a fun thought experiment for me. I love to explore and play with color. And as we look at these really bright summery yellows, I want to take this opportunity to give another huge thank you to today's sponsor, the Color Alchemy Masterclass. Registration for the spring session is open through February 27th, 2026, and you can learn more over at alanawilcox.com. I'll have a link to Alana's website down in the video description. This yellow makes me so happy. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I love to observe something when I'm dyeing my yarn, and then to use that observation to ask a question that I can answer, to form a hypothesis, and design controls to just see what will happen as we play with color and yarn. Now, a lot of this artistry isn't necessarily related to my PhD in biochemistry and molecular pharmacology. At this point, I'm so far removed from those studies. But it's still fun when the Dr. Brown in me comes out full force, and I enjoy playing around with things like this and making observations from different pigments. Now, sometimes the things that I decide I want to try aren't necessarily an experiment. It's more of, ooh, this is another beautiful thing I want to try to create. And ultimately, all of this yarn right here is very beautiful. And that is the end goal. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I post at least twice a week and you don't want to miss any of it. Thank you so much for watching.